Welcome to Wispy History, where the past drifts softly through the veil of time and stories unfold like forgotten dreams. Each night, we journey together through the echoes of history, tales of empires, philosophers, inventors, and mysteries that shaped our world, one whispered story at a time. Before we begin, take a moment, breathe in, settle down, and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love knowing how far our quiet community reaches. If you'd like to keep these stories alive, you can support Wispy History by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Now, find a comfortable spot, close your eyes, and let your mind drift as we step softly into tonight's story. On a mild winter morning in 1955, a baby boy came quietly into the world at a San Francisco hospital. He was given the name Stephen Paul Jobs, though the path that led him to that name was anything but straightforward. His biological parents, a young unmarried graduate student and a Syrian immigrant, had reluctantly decided to put him up for adoption. A childless couple, Paul and Clara Jobs, eagerly adopted the infant and took him home to their modest house in Mountain View, California. Paul was a machinist by trade, a salt-of-the-earth man who loved working with his hands. Clara was a bookkeeper, practical and warm. They had longed for a child, and now here he was, a dark-eyed boy with a sharp gaze. They promised the anxious birth mother that they would give him a good life and an education. And finally, the papers were signed. The little boy would be Steve Jobs, son of Paul and Clara, raised in the heart of what would one day become Silicon Valley. Steve's early childhood unfolded in the 1960s amidst the orchards and tract houses of Santa Clara County. From the start, he was a curious and energetic child. Paul Jobs, who loved to tinker, set up a small workbench in the garage for his son. As a toddler, Steve watched wide-eyed as his dad expertly rebuilt engines and crafted furniture by hand. Paul wasn't formally educated, but he was smart and precise, taking pride in doing things well. He taught Steve how to use a hammer and a screwdriver, how to sand and paint, instilling in him a respect for craftsmanship. "Measure twice, cut once," Paul would say, showing the boy that quality mattered. Steve admired his father's gentle skill, the way Paul could fix anything or build something from nothing. Those hours together in the garage left an imprint on Steve's young mind, that making great things was possible, and that hands-on work and attention to detail were their own reward. In school, however, young Steve was a handful. He was a bright boy, perhaps too bright to sit quietly in a regimented classroom. At Montaloma Elementary, he quickly grew bored and restless. He daydreamed, pulled pranks, and tested limits. Once he glued a teacher's chair locks together, earning a stern talking to. Another time he released a snake in class just to see the chaos. Authority did not impress him. He had a habit of questioning everything, a trait that would later become central to his identity. His teachers often scolded him for not behaving, but Steve simply found the material unstimulating. Paul and Clara, hearing of his antics, understood that their son wasn't bad. He was unengaged. Rather than punish him harshly, they lobbied to skip him ahead a grade to challenge him. Indeed, Steve skipped 5th grade, which helped a little, but he still felt out of place. By the time he was 12, he was a loner in the schoolyard, the oddball kid who didn't neatly fit into the usual cliques of jocks, nerds, or troublemakers. He was an individualist even as a child. When Steve was around 13 years old, a remarkable incident hinted at the boldness and ingenuity that would later define him. Fascinated by electronics, he wanted to build a frequency counter for a hobby project, but lacked some parts. Most kids would have given up or saved their allowance to buy them. Not Steve. He looked up the number of Bill Hewlett, the famous co-founder of Hewlett-Packard, and cold called him at his home. Bill Hewlett answered the phone to hear an earnest teenage boy asking for spare electronic parts. Impressed by Steve's audacity, Hewlett not only provided the parts, but also offered the boy a summer job at HP's plant, assembling frequency counters. That summer, Steve found himself on a factory floor, learning from engineers and soaking up everything about electronics. He was just a kid, yet unafraid to reach out to a giant of industry. A glimpse of the fearless entrepreneurial spirit that would characterize his later life. By his teens, Steve's family had moved to Los Altos, into a house on Chris Drive, a home that, unbeknownst to anyone then, would later become the fabled birthplace of Apple Computer. In Homestead High School, Steve continued to straddle worlds. He grew his hair long, adopted the jeans and t-shirt look of the era, and embraced the counterculture vibes of late 60s California. He was known to experiment with LSD in these years, later describing his psychedelic trips as one of the most important experiences of his life. The drugs, the music, the literature he devoured, from Shakespeare to the poetry of Dylan Thomas, all broadened his horizons beyond the narrow confines of school. He became deeply interested in art and literature, even as he maintained a passion for electronics. Classmates recall a teenager who read Plato for fun, but could also talk circuits and wires. He wasn't the stereotypical nerd. He wasn't the aimless hippie either. Steve occupied a unique middle ground, intensely intellectual, fiercely independent, and craving something more from life than what traditional education offered. Fatefully, at Homestead High, Steve met another youth who shared his love for electronics, Steve Wozniak, 5 years older but kindred in spirit. Wozniak, or Woz, was a shy, brilliant engineering whiz who could build almost anything from scratch. They were introduced by a mutual friend in 1971. Young Steve Jobs was just 16, Wozniak around 21. Despite the age difference, they clicked. Both loved pranking. They famously built and slyly sold blue boxes, illicit devices that could trick the telephone system into giving free long-distance calls. The blue box caper became local legend. Wozniak engineered the device, and Jobs figured out how to sell it to students and others, splitting the profits. One night, flush with excitement from a successful sale, Steve looked at Woz and remarked that if they could pull off something like the blue box, essentially outsmarting the biggest telephone company in the land, they could do anything. Years later, he would say without that blue box, there would have been no Apple. The partnership of the two Steves was already showing its chemistry. Wozniak's engineering genius and Jobs' vision and salesmanship combined to create something neither could have done alone. In 1972, brimming with rebellious energy and idealism, 17-year-old Steve moved north to attend Reed College in Oregon. Reed was known for its liberal, free-spirited environment, a perfect fit for Jobs' curious mind. But the formality of college classes chafed at him just as grade school had. After a single semester, Steve dropped out of Reed, deciding it wasn't worth his parents' meager savings to pay tuition when he wasn't finding his purpose in the required courses. Instead, he became an auditor, hanging around campus, sleeping on friends' dorm room floors, and dropping in on classes that interested him. One of those was a calligraphy course. Steve, ever drawn to art and design, became fascinated by the elegance of letter forms and spacing. He learned about serif and sans serif typefaces, about what made great typography great. At the time, it seemed impractical. Calligraphy had no obvious use in his life. And yet, he was compelled by beauty and craftsmanship again. Only much later would he connect the dots, realizing that this seemingly random fascination would profoundly influence the Macintosh computer, which would offer a rich variety of fonts and aesthetic typography unheard of on computers before. Steve's life was already a tapestry of unorthodox experiences, each thread seemingly disparate, but eventually weaving together. During this period, Steve embarked on a spiritual quest as well. In 1974, he left the Oregon campus behind and traveled to India, seeking enlightenment. With a college buddy, he wandered through dusty villages, visited ashrams, and meditated in the Himalayas. The trip was not glamorous. Steve fell ill with dysentery at one point and had his head shaved by monks, but it was transformative. He returned home 7 months later, barefoot, head shaved, draped in Indian cotton, and profoundly influenced by Eastern spirituality. He had embraced Zen Buddhism, learning to focus his mind and appreciate intuition. Meditation became part of his routine. The minimalist aesthetic and mindfulness of Zen would later permeate the products he created. The simplicity, the focus on essence, the almost reverential approach to design. Seeds planted by his time in India. He later said that taking LSD and visiting India were among the most important experiences of his life, opening his mind to new ways of thinking about himself and the world. Back in California in 1975, Steve Jobs was a changed young man, spiritually awakened, unconventional in appearance, but still searching for what to do with his life. He picked up a job as a technician at Atari, the video game company, working the night shift. It was a perfect fit for a shaggy, anti-establishment kid who didn't mind odd hours and had a talent for electronics. Atari's founder, Nolan Bushnell, found Steve brilliant, but a bit difficult. He was known to come to work barefoot and openly challenge colleagues with his strong opinions. At one point, Bushnell handed Steve a tough assignment: help design a circuit board for a new game, Breakout, with a bonus for using as few chips as possible. Steve knew his own limitations in electronics design, so he turned to his old friend Wozniak. The two locked themselves in a room for 4 days, hardly sleeping, and Wozniak, in an astonishing feat, reduced the chip count to an absolute minimum. Atari was impressed and paid a hefty bonus. Steve received the check and, in an act that hinted at both his shrewdness and his youthful moral ambiguity, he gave Wozniak only a small cut, letting Woz believe it was a modest payment. Wozniak would only learn years later that Steve had pocketed the larger share. Graciously, Wozniak said he'd have given his friend the money if he'd just asked, but it was an early sign that Steve could be unsentimental when it came to business. By his early 20s, Steve was a strange mix. Part electronics nerd, part enlightened seeker, part self-assured salesman. It was then, in 1975, that he started attending meetings of the Homebrew Computer Club with Wozniak. The Homebrew Club was a gathering of Silicon Valley engineers and hobbyists, people who saw magic in microchips and dreamt of bringing computing power to everyone. In a dim garage or a Stanford auditorium, these enthusiasts would show off their DIY computer kits and swap ideas. Wozniak, in particular, had been working on a little something, a simple computer built around the new microprocessors. At Homebrew, Woz showed Steve his latest project, a single-board computer capable of displaying text on a screen. It was crude, but ingenious, one of the first of its kind. Steve's eyes lit up. Where Woz saw a fun technical challenge, Steve saw potential. He saw a product that every hobbyist might want to buy, and perhaps more. In that moment, Steve's entrepreneurial spirit kicked into high gear. He insisted to Wozniak that they had to turn this into a product and a company. Woz, ever humble, was skeptical. Who would buy a computer from two young guys in a garage? But Steve's conviction was infectious. Even if we fail, he told Woz, at least we can say we had our own company. We'll have a story to tell. So it was that in 1976, in the Jobs family garage on Crisp Drive, Apple Computer Company was born. Steve Jobs was just 21. Steve Wozniak, 26. With Steve's enthusiastic persuasion and a dream of empowering people with technology, they convinced Ronald Wayne, an older friend, to join as a partner to handle administrative tasks. On April 1st, 1976, the trio signed the papers. They decided to call it Apple. Legend has it the name was chosen by Steve after a visit to an apple orchard commune in Oregon. and perhaps because Apple would appear early in the phone book. In any case, the name felt friendly, not technical, the sort of whimsical touch Steve liked. Wayne, however, got cold feet and backed out within 2 weeks, leaving Jobs and Wozniak as the core of Apple. The venture began with very little money. To fund their first product, Wozniak sold his beloved HP calculator and Steve sold his Volkswagen van. They scraped together a few $1,000s, just enough to buy parts. Their first creation, the Apple I, wasn't a full, polished computer as we know them now. It was essentially a naked circuit board. There was no case, no keyboard, no monitor. Customers would have to add their own. But it worked. Wozniak's design was elegant and affordable, a miracle of economy in an era when computers were either huge corporate machines or kits for hardcore hobbyists. Steve's role was to package and sell this invention. He hustled relentlessly, making call after call from his parents' kitchen phone, trying to drum up interest. At night in the garage, Woz and a few helpers, including their friend Dan Kotke, would hand solder components onto boards. During the day, Steve would drive those boards to local electronics stores to seek buyers. In a pivotal deal, a local store called the Byte Shop, run by Paul Terrell, ordered 50 Apple I boards on the condition that they be fully assembled. It was a make-or-break moment for the young company. They had to build those 50 machines quickly with virtually no operating capital. Somehow, they did it. The Apple I boards sold for about $500 each. Suddenly, Apple Computer had real revenue. Over the next year, they sold around 200 Apple I computers. Encouraged by this early success and fueled by Steve's ambitious vision, Apple moved fast. Mike Markkula, a retired Intel millionaire with marketing savvy, saw promise in the scruffy duo and invested around $250,000, becoming a mentor to Steve. With Markkula's guidance, Apple was soon formally incorporated and ready to build a more polished machine. In 1977, just 1 year after their start, Apple released the Apple II, a beautifully integrated personal computer with a plastic casing designed in part by Steve, who insisted that computers should look friendly and approachable, a keyboard, color graphics, and the ability to connect to a regular TV as a display. It was one of the first true personal computers meant for a broad audience, not just hobbyists or engineers. When Steve and Wozniak demonstrated the Apple II at the West Coast Computer Fair in April 1977, crowds gathered, buzzing with excitement. Here was a machine ordinary people could imagine using at home or in school. Orders poured in. The Apple II became a breakthrough hit, one of the most successful computers of the era. By the end of the 1970s, Apple grew from its humble garage origins into a burgeoning company with hundreds of employees, a line of products, and a skyrocketing reputation in Silicon Valley. For Steve Jobs, these early years at Apple were a whirlwind. Barely in his mid-20s, he was now leading teams of engineers and marketing a product across the country. Dressed in sandals and enthusiastic energy, he would pitch the Apple II to anyone who would listen, emphasizing how it was the computer for the rest of us. His passion was palpable. He was dreaming big, talking about putting a computer in every home, in every classroom. The shy, solitary boy had transformed into a charismatic young entrepreneur who could hold an audience rapt. In 1980, just 4 years after that first Apple I board was built in the garage, Apple Computer went public. The IPO was explosive. Investors were clamoring for a piece of this high-flying new tech company. Overnight, Steve Jobs, at only 25 years old, became worth well over $200 million. He was lauded in the press as the wonderkind of a new industry, one of the youngest people ever on the Forbes list of richest Americans. For a kid who grew up with modest means, it was dizzying. But Steve often insisted that money wasn't the point. In an interview around that time, when asked about suddenly being wealthy, he laughed it off. It was all a bit surreal to him. And he said something like, It's amusing that it gets so much attention because it's not what's important. What was important to Steve was the mission. He truly believed Apple was going to change the world by democratizing technology. As Apple soared, Steve's intensity at work only grew. He had always been willful and exacting, and now with more responsibility, those traits became even more pronounced. He demanded excellence from everyone, pushing his team beyond their limits. To some employees, this was inspiring. They felt part of something meaningful, almost a revolution. To others, it was intimidating. Steve could be combative and unfiltered in his criticism. If a design was subpar, he might call it trash or worse to the engineer's face. Stories began circulating of Steve's fiery temper and perfectionism. Yet those who believed in the vision stuck with him, often achieving feats they never thought possible under the spell of what came to be called Steve's reality distortion field. That was the nickname the Mac team later gave to Steve's uncanny ability to convince anyone that the impossible was possible. Whether it was persuading an engineer to dramatically shrink a circuit board in days when it should take weeks, or inspiring a marketing team to design a campaign overnight. He just had a way of making you believe and a relentless drive that was contagious. During these booming Apple II years, Steve's personal life was also eventful. He had a long on and off relationship with Chrysanne Brennan, his high school girlfriend, a free-spirited artist. In 1978, Chrysanne gave birth to a baby girl, Lisa. Steve, at 23, was not ready for fatherhood. In fact, he initially denied paternity, insisting he wasn't the father. It was a difficult and emotionally complex time for them both. Chrysanne struggled financially as a single mother, while Steve focused obsessively on Apple. Tellingly, around the same time, Apple was developing a new computer as a successor to the Apple II, and Steve named it Lisa. Later, he would playfully claim the name stood for a technical acronym, but it was widely noted that perhaps, on some subconscious level, he had acknowledged his daughter. It wasn't until years later that Steve accepted Lisa as his child, after a DNA test and court case, and began to slowly build a relationship with her. The young Steve Jobs of the early 1980s was brilliant and driven, but also emotionally raw and at times immature. He was learning and growing in the public eye, and some lessons, like accepting responsibility for his personal life, took time. By the early 1980s, Apple was facing new challenges. The Apple II had been a massive hit, but competitors were springing up. IBM, the giant of the industry, had finally entered the personal computer market with the IBM PC in 1981, and it quickly became a formidable rival. Steve knew that Apple needed to stay ahead by innovating. He became fixated on creating the next big thing that would outshine the Apple II and leapfrog the competition. That next big thing turned out to be an idea sparked by an inspiring visit to Xerox's Palo Alto Research Center, PARC. In 1980, Steve and some Apple engineers visited PARC and saw something revolutionary: computers with graphical user interfaces, windows, icons, menus, and a little pointing device called a mouse. At a time when most computers were controlled by typing arcane commands, what Steve saw was the future, a computer anyone could use by pointing and clicking. He was electrified by the concept. He immediately directed Apple to pour resources into developing a new kind of computer with a friendly graphical interface. Apple actually started two projects. One was the Lisa computer, a powerful machine intended for business, and the other was a scrappy internal skunkworks project codenamed Macintosh, led initially by engineer Jeff Raskin. Steve was involved in Lisa at first, but he was eventually pushed off that team due to his volatile management style. However, he quickly seized control of the Macintosh project, seeing it as the vehicle for his vision of an affordable, simple computer for the rest of us. The Mac team that Steve built was young, passionate, and often worked 90-hour weeks to fulfill his vision. Steve rallied them with charismatic speeches, telling them they were making history. He plastered a pirate flag above their building, joking that it's better to be a pirate than join the Navy, meaning he wanted his team to stay rebel-minded and not fall into corporate complacency. Under Steve's intense leadership, the Macintosh slowly took shape. A small box with a built-in screen, a mouse, and a beautiful graphic interface with icons you could click. Steve was obsessed with the details, the look of the fonts, the responsiveness of the mouse, even the design of the circuit board inside, which customers would never see, but he insisted it should be elegant and neat like a work of art. As the launch of the Macintosh approached, Steve's showmanship and sense of drama kicked into high gear. He wanted the unveiling to be perfect. He had already set the stage with an iconic television commercial. During the 1984 Super Bowl, millions of viewers saw Apple's bold ad, directed by Ridley Scott, depicting a lone heroine smashing the screen of an Orwellian Big Brother figure. The message: on January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh, and you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984. It was a masterstroke of marketing. People who had never touched a computer were suddenly talking about Apple's upcoming machine. January 24th, 1984. A hall full of shareholders and journalists in Cupertino gathered to witness the introduction of the Macintosh. Steve Jobs, 28 years old, took the stage in a bow tie and suit, a rare formal look for him in those days, as he was trying to impress the business crowd. He had rehearsed endlessly for this moment. The pressure was immense. As the lights dimmed, he began speaking about the journey to create this computer. Then, at the climactic moment, he walked to a small table draped in a cloth and dramatically pulled out the Macintosh from its bag. The machine looked tiny and cute compared to clunky PCs of the day. Steve inserted a floppy disk and the Mac sprang to life on the huge projection screen for the audience to see. It ran through a dazzling demo, drawing graphics and playing synthesized music. And then the Macintosh spoke. In a clear, digital voice, it said, "Hello, I'm Macintosh. It sure is great to get out of that bag." The crowd erupted in laughter, then cheers and applause. Steve beamed, a mix of pride and emotion visible on his face. In that moment, all the sweat and shouting, the late nights, the passionate arguments to build something insanely great, it all crystallized into a triumph. One can imagine Steve backstage just before that reveal, heart-pounding, hands perhaps a bit shaky as they cradled the computer, a rare flicker of anxiety in his chest. Would it crash or would it amaze? And then stepping into the spotlight with his creation, feeling the electric connection with his audience. He had always wanted to make a dent in the universe. And as the Macintosh said hello, Steve must have felt he had swung a sledgehammer into the status quo of computing. The room full of people gave him a standing ovation. Some even had tears in their eyes, witnessing the birth of what felt like a new era. In truth, no one recorded Steve's private thoughts at that instant, but seeing his bright eyes and slight smile as the applause washed over him, one can imagine the mix of relief, joy, and sheer excitement he felt inside. The Macintosh introduction was more than a product launch. It was Steve Jobs' showmanship and vision on full display, and it captivated the world. In the aftermath of that triumphant launch, Steve was riding high. By 1984, he was not just a young millionaire, but a bona fide celebrity in the tech world, appearing on magazine covers as the boy wonder who was reshaping computing. The Macintosh team were heroes inside Apple, and Steve was their mercurial captain. Yet, even as Apple celebrated the Macintosh, storms were brewing beneath the surface. The Mac, for all its brilliance, was also expensive and limited in its first incarnation. It had only 128K of memory, no hard disk, and at $2,495, it cost more than many typewriters and TVs combined, a tough sell to mainstream consumers despite its friendly interface. Initially, sales were decent thanks to the hype, but by 1985, it was evident the Mac was not going to immediately topple the IBM PC. There were few compatible software programs at first, and many businesses scoffed at its cute icons and mouse, sticking instead with IBM and Microsoft's simpler, text-based systems, which were getting better rapidly. Inside Apple, a power struggle began to form. On one side was Steve, visionary, co-founder, the spirit of the company, but also young and inexperienced in managerial finesse. On the other side was John Sculley, the man Steve himself had recruited in 1983 to be Apple's CEO. Sculley was a seasoned executive from PepsiCo, whom Steve had lured with one of the most famous one-liners in business. Do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life? Or do you want to come with me and change the world? With that, Sculley, intrigued, had joined Apple. At first, Steve and Sculley were close. Steve thought he'd found a partner to help him run the fast-growing company. They even went on long walks together, discussing Apple's future. But as the Mac's commercial performance faltered, Sculley and Apple's board began doubting Steve's approach. The Apple II, the older product, was still the cash cow of the company, and that team felt overlooked and underappreciated as Steve poured all attention into the Macintosh. Tension mounted between the Apple II division and the Macintosh division, which Steve ran almost as a separate entity with its own culture, pirate flag and all. By early 1985, Sculley and some board members came to a grim conclusion. Perhaps Steve Jobs, despite his visionary brilliance, was not the right person to lead Apple's day-to-day operations. Steve, for his part, grew resentful of Sculley's leadership, believing the CEO didn't truly get the vision of the future. The clash came to a head in the spring of 1985. Steve attempted a boardroom coup. He tried to convince Apple's directors to oust Sculley so he, Steve, could take over the company. But Sculley caught wind of the plan and confronted Steve at a board meeting. The board members, many of whom Steve himself had brought on, sided with the more experienced Sculley. They stripped Steve of any real power, removing him from leadership of the Macintosh division and reassigning him to a role that was more symbolic than anything. It was a humiliating defeat for the 30-year-old Steve Jobs. Just a year earlier, he had been on top of the world. Now he was essentially exiled within the company he co-founded. In September 1985, Steve resigned from Apple. He felt betrayed, heartbroken, and liberated all at once. Publicly, he tried to put a positive spin on it, saying it was for the best. Privately, it was one of the darkest moments of his life. Apple had been like his child, and now he was cast out from it. That summer, before his resignation became official, Steve took a walk in the Stanford University campus, a place where he often went to think. His friend and early Apple employee, Dan Kotke, had noted Steve's fondness for strolling on the lawns of Stanford since he hadn't finished college himself. No one knows exactly what went through his head on those walks, but we can imagine the turmoil. The evening breeze rustling through the eucalyptus trees as Steve, now a slender figure with close-cropped hair and intense eyes, walked alone, hands in his pockets. Everything he had built was slipping away. The board's decision felt to him like a personal rejection. Perhaps he felt anger at Sculley, at the board, maybe even at himself for how things had turned out. Perhaps he also felt a strange sense of relief, unshackled from the growing bureaucracy of Apple. Certainly, he felt the ache of loss. How could it be that the company he started in his parents' garage, the company named after his favorite fruit, the company that had been his whole life for nearly a decade, didn't want him? These inner thoughts are not recorded, but one can picture Steve in those reflective moments. A young man at a crossroads, determined not to let this be the end of his story. In later years, Steve would candidly call this ouster the best thing that ever happened to him, because it freed him to start anew. But in 1985, He could not have known that yet. All he knew was that he had to keep moving forward. Steve Jobs did not stay idle for long. True to his character, he channeled his disappointment into new ventures. Within weeks of leaving Apple, he decided to start a new company, one that, in his words, would be even more innovative than Apple. With a handful of loyal colleagues from Apple who resigned to join him, Steve founded Next Inc. in 1985. He was 30 years old, essentially back to square one, but armed with invaluable experience and a still burning vision. Next's goal was to build high-powered workstation computers for universities and research, the kind of perfect computer Steve wished he'd had at college. With $7 million of his own money as startup capital, he set out to create a dream machine for education. The team at Next was small but elite. Steve recruited brilliant engineers and also engaged star designers like Hartmut Esslinger to craft the machine's physical look. Free from Apple's corporate constraints, Steve let his imagination run wild. Over the next few years, Next designed a computer that was technologically advanced and visually stunning, a perfect black cube, a 1 foot by 1 foot magnesium cube casing, minimalist and sleek. Inside, it had cutting-edge components, a fast processor, a high-resolution display, an innovative magneto-optical drive for storage, and the Next operating system, which was based on Unix and years ahead of its time in some ways, with an elegant graphical interface and object-oriented software frameworks. Steve poured himself into every detail of Next, obsessing over the tiniest aspects from the exact gray hue of the cube's case to the mellow tones the computer would chime on startup. In October 1988, after 3 years in development, Steve Jobs unveiled the Next computer at a lavish event in San Francisco's Davies Symphony Hall. This was billed as Steve's comeback, a chance to show the world that he still had the magic. The launch event had classical music, dramatic lighting. It was more akin to a theatrical premiere than a typical product announcement. When Steve stepped on stage wearing a slick suit and tie, he seemed more mature, more polished than the brash kid of the Macintosh days, but the old showmanship was very much alive. He introduced the Next computer as if unveiling a masterpiece, and in many respects, it was. The machine was beautiful, and its capabilities wowed the academic crowd, including the ability to send voice and graphics in email, which was unheard of then. In the audience that day was a young college student who would soon use one of those Next machines to change the course of technology. Tim Berners-Lee, who at CERN would create the very first worldwide web server and browser on a Next computer. That remarkable achievement, the birth of the web, was a testament to how powerful and well-engineered Next technology was. Yet for all its brilliance, the Next computer struggled commercially. It debuted at a price around $6,500 for the basic model, nearly $10,000 with a printer, making it far too expensive for students or even many universities. As Steve had experienced with Lisa and the Macintosh, he once again faced the reality that engineering marvels don't automatically translate into market success, especially when priced too high. All through the late 1980s and early 90s, Steve persisted with Next. The company refined its machines, releasing an improved Next Station and a second-generation Next Cube, even pivoting to focus more on the innovative Next software than on hardware as sales remained low. By 1993, Next stopped making hardware and turned into a software company, leveraging its sophisticated NextStep operating system and development tools. They scored some big clients in finance and government for Next software, but overall, Next remained a niche player. Still, Steve did not consider it a failure. He saw it as an incubator of advanced ideas. Next developed things that were truly ahead of their time, tools and software that would later become extremely important. In fact, the core of Next software would eventually form the foundation of Apple's renaissance, though that chapter was yet to come. Steve's perfectionism at Next was legendary. He insisted on the highest quality, even if that meant delays and high costs. He made sure that even the circuit boards inside the Next computer were immaculate and clean. The team often joked that Steve wanted the inside of the machine to be as beautiful as the outside, a sign of purity of design philosophy, albeit one that didn't always align with financial practicality. While Steve was pouring energy into Next, another venture was taking shape in parallel, one that would eventually define a large part of his legacy: Pixar. In 1986, the year after founding Next, Steve was approached with an interesting proposition. The famed filmmaker George Lucas, creator of Star Wars, was looking to sell the computer graphics division of his company, Lucasfilm, to raise some cash after a divorce. This small division, headed by Dr. Ed Catmull and a talented animator named John Lasseter, had cutting-edge graphics technology and a vision to one day make full-length computer-animated films. Steve, always captivated by technology and art, saw potential. He agreed to buy the group for $10 million, half for the technology rights, half as capital for the new independent company. They named it Pixar. At first, Pixar was a hardware company selling a high-end graphics computer, the Pixar Image Computer, and also a software company with its RenderMan graphics software. These products didn't gain a broad market, and Pixar bled money for years, nearly exhausting Steve's patience and wallet. Yet, all the while, John Lasseter's tiny animation team was creating delightful short films, like Luxo Jr., featuring the little hopping lamp that later became Pixar's mascot, and Tin Toy, which won critical praise and even Academy Awards. These shorts and some TV commercial work demonstrated Pixar's true strength: storytelling through computer animation. For nearly a decade, Steve Jobs subsidized Pixar, investing millions of his own money and at times considering selling it. There were moments he almost did sell. At one point, Microsoft's co-founder Paul Allen was interested, and another time he nearly struck a deal with a character named Intel. But each time, something kept Steve from letting go. Perhaps it was belief in the team's talent, or the simple fact that Steve loved the intersection of technology and art, which Pixar embodied. The breakthrough finally came in 1995. Pixar, in partnership with Disney, produced the world's first feature-length computer-animated film, Toy Story. It was a gamble, an entire movie created with computers, starring animated toys that come to life when humans aren't around. Steve was involved in the deal-making. He had negotiated the partnership with Disney's CEO at the time, Michael Eisner, years before, but wisely left the creative work to John Lasseter and his team. When Toy Story hit theaters for Thanksgiving 1995, it was nothing short of a revelation. Audiences fell in love with Woody, Buzz Lightyear, and the groundbreaking visual style. The film was both a box office smash and a critical triumph, heralding a new era in animation. Suddenly, Pixar transformed from a money-losing tech company into Hollywood's hottest new studio. Steve Jobs, who had remained Pixar's majority owner and chairman, found himself with another massive success, this time in the entertainment industry. The success of Toy Story had another immediate effect. Steve decided to take Pixar public. In 1995, just a week after Toy Story's release, Pixar's IPO happened, and it exceeded everyone's expectations. The stock sale made Steve a billionaire on paper for the first time. In fact, he now had a fortune that, for once, dwarfed his Apple wealth from earlier days. At age 40, Steve Jobs had reinvented himself. He was no longer just the guy who founded Apple and got fired. He was now the guy who founded Apple, started Next, and runs Pixar, the genius behind the first-ever computer-animated blockbuster. It was a sweet form of vindication. Importantly, in these years away from Apple, Steve grew as a leader and a person. Colleagues at Pixar found him to be more patient, more open to collaboration than the young terror he'd sometimes been at Apple. He had learned to hire great people and trust them, at least in the realms where he knew he wasn't the expert, like the storytelling at Pixar. He would still have strong opinions and strategic input. For example, he was deeply involved in Pixar's business dealings and often contributed ideas on marketing or even story concepts. But he gave creatives like Lasseter and Catmull the room to shine. Pixar's culture was a bit gentler than Apple's, and Steve respected that. In interviews years later, Pixar employees described Steve during those days as mellowed and matured, someone who had clearly been tempered by the highs and lows he'd experienced. On the personal front, the late 1980s and early 90s were significant for Steve as well. In 1986, shortly after leaving Apple, he took a profound step by searching for his biological family. He managed to find his birth mother, Joanne Sheeble Simpson, and learned that he had a biological sister, Mona Simpson, who was a novelist. Steve met Mona, and they formed a sibling bond that lasted the rest of his life. Perhaps meeting his birth family gave him some closure or understanding about his identity. He later expressed gratitude to his birth mother for not aborting him and for giving him a chance at life with the loving adoptive parents he had. Around the same time, Steve finally apologized and reconciled with Chrisanne Brennan and their daughter Lisa. Through the influence of his newfound sister Mona, Steve began to take responsibility as Lisa's father. By the early 90s, Lisa, then a teenager, even came to live with Steve part-time. Those who knew him observed that Steve was slowly becoming more empathetic and learning to value personal relationships more. A major bright spot in Steve's personal life arrived in 1989 when he met a young Stanford MBA student named Laureen Powell. Steve was giving a lecture at Stanford's business school. Laureen happened to sit in the front row. Steve, ever the romantic at heart, was immediately smitten. He lost his train of thought during the talk because he kept glancing at this intriguing woman with a kind smile and intelligent eyes. After the lecture, he boldly introduced himself to her in the parking lot and asked if she would join him for dinner. That very night, instead of a planned work dinner, Steve took Laureen out. Thus began a great love in his life. Laureen was strong, grounded, and could hold her own with Steve's intense personality. They fell deeply in love. On March 18, 1991, in the natural splendor of Yosemite National Park, Steve and Laureen were married in a small Buddhist ceremony, officiated by Kobun Chino Otogawa, Steve's Zen teacher. Steve was 36 and ready to start a new chapter. Soon came children. Their son Reed was born later in 1991, followed by daughters Erin in 1995 and Eve in 1998. Friends noticed that fatherhood softened Steve in many ways. He was still passionate about his work, but having a family with Laureen gave him a different perspective and a deeper sense of purpose beyond the boardroom. He would change diapers, read stories to his kids at bedtime, and try to be home for dinner when he wasn't traveling. Simple acts of family life that balanced his otherwise frenetic professional world. By the mid-1990s, Steve Jobs had a full life. Next was small, but plugging away. Pixar was thriving with more films in production, like A Bug's Life and Toy Story 2, and he had a beautiful family. But something was brewing back at the company of his youth: Apple. The once high-flying Apple had fallen on hard times. After Steve left, Apple enjoyed a few years of relative prosperity. The Macintosh gradually gained traction, especially in desktop publishing, thanks to products like the LaserWriter printer and Adobe's PostScript and PageMaker software. But as the 90s progressed, Microsoft Windows evolved into a formidable competitor, bringing GUI computing, inspired in part by the Mac, to the mass market on cheaper hardware. Apple's market share eroded. A series of CEOs, including John Sculley, then Michael Spindler, then Gil Amelio, struggled to find the way forward. Apple had too many product models, not enough focus, and crucially, an aging operating system. They tried for years to develop a next-generation OS internally, a project codenamed Copeland, but it failed. By 1996, Apple was flirting with bankruptcy. Its stock was at rock bottom. Loyal users were dismayed as each year Apple's innovative edge seemed to dull. In a twist of fate, Apple decided the solution was to buy an advanced operating system from outside to replace its own. After considering various candidates, including a company run by another legend, Jean-Louis Gassai's BOS, Apple surprised the industry by choosing to acquire Next in December 1996 for $400 million. Overnight, Steve Jobs went from being a distant memory at Apple to being the prodigal son whose technology was now to save the company. The deal closed in early 1997, and Steve returned to Apple as an advisor to the CEO and the board. Officially, he was just there to help integrate Next software, but it didn't take long for everyone to realize that Steve Jobs was once again assuming leadership. In July 1997, Apple's board pushed out CEO Gil Amelio, whose turnaround efforts had failed, and they asked Steve to step in as interim CEO, a role he famously dubbed the IEO. Steve's return to Apple marked the beginning of one of the most remarkable turnarounds in business history. When he arrived, Apple was producing a dozen different models in various incoherent product lines. One of the first things Steve did was cut through the confusion with almost brutal clarity. In a meeting with Apple's product teams, he took a marker and drew a simple 4-quadrant grid on a whiteboard. Along one axis, consumer versus pro. On the other, desktop versus portable. He declared that Apple would focus on just 4 great products, one for each quadrant, a consumer desktop and notebook, and a professional desktop and notebook. Everything else would be canceled. The room was shocked. Projects that teams had spent months or years on were immediately shelved. But this decisive focus was exactly what Apple needed to conserve its dwindling resources and channel energy into making a few outstanding devices. Steve also slashed expenditures mercilessly. He ended many peripheral projects, for instance, the Newton PDA, which had a small fan base but wasn't a success, and even eliminated Apple's philanthropy programs at the time, saying the company needed to get healthy before it could give money away again. This era showed Steve at his toughest and most pragmatic. The friendly family man Steve at home was a relentless, unsentimental force at work. Apple employees quickly learned that an encounter with him in the elevator could be nerve-wracking. There were tales, a bit exaggerated, of people being fired before the elevator reached the ground floor, if Steve discovered they weren't contributing to what he deemed important. Although the legend of immediate elevator firings was mostly a myth, it symbolized the fear and respect he commanded. Yet, many also felt inspired. Steve gave Apple a vision again. "We're going to make Apple shine," and his charisma rallied the remaining faithful. He forged a shocking partnership with Bill Gates' Microsoft in 1997, announcing on stage, to a chorus of gasps and even boos, that Microsoft would invest $150 million in Apple and continue developing Microsoft Office for Mac. In return, Apple would make Internet Explorer the default browser. This deal secured badly needed cash and software support and ended long-standing lawsuits between the two companies. At that Macworld conference where he announced it, Steve famously said, "We have to let go of this notion that for Apple to win, Microsoft has to lose." It was a pragmatic olive branch that many never expected Jobs to extend to his old rival Gates. But Steve had matured. He would do whatever it took to save Apple, even if it meant partnering with a former adversary. Then came the products, and with them, Apple's resurgence. In 1998, under Steve's keen direction and working hand in hand with a talented British designer he had discovered back in 1997, named Jonathan "Joni" Ive, Apple introduced the iMac. The iMac G3 was like nothing else on the market, a playfully colorful, translucent, all-in-one computer that looked more like a piece of pop art than a piece of office equipment. It came in blueberry, grape, tangerine, lime, and strawberry, bright candy colors that screamed fun at a time when PCs were drab beige boxes. Steve insisted on details like a carry handle on top and that the machine be free of floppy disk drives, a bold move at the time, signaling the floppy's obsolescence. The iMac was about embracing the future. It had built-in internet networking, hence the I for internet, and making computing friendly and exciting again. The marketing around it, "Think Different," was Apple's new slogan, celebrated rebels and innovators of history, implicitly putting Apple and Steve in their company. When the iMac hit the market, it became an instant hit, especially in education and with home users. Millions sold. It single-handedly brought profits back to Apple and proved that the company wasn't just alive, but capable of leading in design and user experience. Apple's turnaround had begun in earnest. The late 1990s and early 2000s became a period of relentless innovation from the newly revitalized Apple, spearheaded by Steve Jobs. He removed the interim from his CEO title in 2000, cementing his role. With Jony Ive's artistic eye and Steve's demanding vision, Apple rolled out a string of hits. They followed the iMac with the iBook, a clamshell-colored laptop, and the professional PowerMac G4 and elegant PowerBook notebooks. Apple also introduced its own retail stores in 2001, a move many pundits predicted would fail. After all, Gateway's computer stores had flopped. But Steve, understanding the importance of controlling the customer experience, went ahead and opened pristine, stylish Apple stores that often featured glass staircases and airy layouts. To this day, Steve is credited as a co-inventor on the patent for those glass stairs. That's how deep his involvement in design went. The Apple stores turned out to be a huge success, providing a direct touch point for consumers to discover Apple products with great service. In the background, another profound change was happening at Apple thanks to Steve's Next technology. Apple was rebuilding its operating system on the foundation of Next Step, which became Mac OS X. In 2001, Mac OS X was released, a modern, stable, Unix-based OS with the same elegant feel that Next's software had, combined with Apple's user-friendly interface. It gave Macs a core as technologically robust as any computer on Earth, and it was the platform on which Apple could build for the next 2 decades. It's poetic that the software Steve created during his wilderness years at Next became the heart that pumped new life into Apple. But perhaps the biggest shift in this era was Steve's realization that Apple could move beyond computers. He began speaking about the digital hub strategy, the idea that the personal computer, particularly the Mac, should become a hub for emerging digital devices like music players, cameras, and camcorders. At a time when tech companies were still PC-centric, Steve peered into the future and saw a consumer electronics revolution coming. And he wanted Apple to be at the forefront. It started with software. Apple introduced iTunes in 2001, a simple, elegantly designed jukebox program to rip and organize music on your Mac. But the real game changer came later that year, on October 23, 2001, when Steve unveiled a device from his pocket that would redefine Apple and indeed the entire music industry, the iPod. The original iPod was a small white box with a tiny screen and a brilliant click wheel for navigation. It could hold 1,000 songs in your pocket, as Steve touted on stage, an eyebrow-raising amount at the time. The simplicity of its interface and the seamless integration with iTunes made it an instant hit for Mac users. Initially, some critics shrugged. There had been MP3 players before, though none as well thought out. But once people got their hands on iPods, it became an object of cultural desire. The iPod wasn't just a gadget. It was a fashion statement, a little piece of the Apple ethos you could carry with you, complete with the iconic white earbuds. Under Steve's leadership, Apple kept iterating the iPod, making it smaller, sleeker, with higher capacity. By 2003, they opened the iTunes Music Store, a revolutionary online store where for 99 cents a song, people could legally purchase and download music with ease. Steve personally negotiated with the major record labels to bring them on board. With his reality distortion field in full effect, he convinced an industry terrified of piracy, remember the days of Napster, that selling songs online a la carte was the way forward. The iTunes Store exploded. Within a week, customers bought over 1 million songs. Suddenly, Apple wasn't just a computer company, it was a power player in music. Through these successes, Steve Jobs became more than just a tech CEO. He was something of a pop culture figure, revered by many. His keynote presentations, dubbed Steve-a-Notes at Macworld or Apple's Worldwide Developers Conference, became highly anticipated events, almost like tech rock concerts. Clad in his now signature uniform, a black turtleneck, Levi's blue jeans, and New Balance sneakers, Steve would take the stage with a giant screen behind him, methodically building up excitement as he revealed one more thing after another. Audiences hung on his words. He had a way of telling a product story that made features sound exciting and breakthroughs feel personal and inevitable. He was often funny, sometimes sharp, always passionate. The media started comparing him to the likes of Edison and Disney, a creative genius who was changing industries left and right. Under the spotlight of this resurgence, one challenge emerged that Steve couldn't control through willpower and creativity: his health. In October 2003, during a routine scan for kidney stones, doctors discovered a tumor on Steve's pancreas. It was a rare form called an islet cell, or pancreatic neuroendocrine tumor, which, importantly, was slow-growing and potentially treatable with surgery, very different from the typically deadly pancreatic adenocarcinoma. True to his complex nature, Steve didn't opt for immediate surgery. He was skeptical of traditional medicine and for 9 months tried alternative approaches, special diets, acupuncture, herbal remedies, hoping to stave off or reverse the tumor's growth. Those close to him were very worried. Some gently urged him to have the surgery, but Steve took his own counsel. Ultimately, by mid-2004, he agreed to a surgical procedure, a modified Whipple procedure. Apple's board and the public were told only after the fact, when Steve announced he had successfully undergone treatment for a cancerous tumor. For a while, it seemed Steve had beaten it. He returned to work, thinner but as energetic as ever, telling employees he was cured. In hindsight, that delay in treatment was a risky gamble, and one of the few decisions Steve likely regretted, as the cancer would eventually recur. But at the time, in 2004, with the tumor out, Steve resumed life at full throttle. If anything, facing mortality had refined his perspective, much as his youthful spiritual seeking had. In 2005, he gave the commencement address at Stanford University, and in that speech, which has since inspired millions, he spoke about life, love, and death with poignant clarity. He urged the graduates to stay hungry, stay foolish, quoting the farewell message of the Whole Earth catalog that had inspired him in his youth. He shared how getting fired from Apple was awful, but led to the most creative period of his life. And, prophetically, he talked about remembering that death is very likely the single best invention of life, because it clears out the old to make way for the new, and how one should live each day as if it might be one's last. The audience was rapt. Many had no idea he'd just fought off cancer. It was Steve at his wisest and most reflective, publicly showing a philosophical, even gentle side that balanced the hard-driving businessman people saw on stage or read about in the news. Apple's momentum continued to build. 2006 saw a significant business deal. The Walt Disney Company acquired Pixar for $7.4 billion in stock. This deal made Steve Jobs the largest single shareholder in Disney, owning about 7% of the company, and he joined Disney's board of directors. This development suddenly made Steve's net worth skyrocket to around $4 to $5 billion, far surpassing what he had ever made from Apple. By the time of Pixar's sale, Steve's wealth was estimated around $7 to $10 billion, placing him among the richest Americans. Though notably, he had long since decided that extreme wealth was not something he'd hoard for family dynasties. Like his friend Bill Gates, Steve planned that much of his fortune would eventually be put to philanthropic or other uses by his wife Lorene. Indeed, he believed in not simply handing his children huge wealth, wanting them to find their own path. But material measures aside, Steve's focus remained on innovation at Apple. Having reshaped music with the iPod and iTunes, he had even bigger plans brewing. The convergence of phones and computers was the next frontier. By 2005-2006, cell phones were everywhere, but none were truly great at handling music or internet, and certainly none were Apple-level intuitive. Steve was dissatisfied. Even the phones that could play music, like some Sony Walkman phones, were clunky. Within Apple's design labs, a secret project had been underway to create a touchscreen tablet, but as they shrank it down, they realized it could become the basis for a revolutionary phone. Steve being Steve, he drove the project with manic intensity, bringing together a crack team from the iPod division, OS X software engineers, and hardware designers to do what many thought impossible. Make a phone that would be also a superb music player and internet communicator, all with a completely new multi-touch interface, and to do it in absolute secrecy. On January 9th, 2007, the world would see the result at Macworld in San Francisco. That day, the anticipation in the auditorium was electric. Steve took the stage for his keynote, and when he got to the much-awaited "one more thing," he began with a teasing twinkle. "This is a day I've been looking forward to for 2.5 years." He described 3 revolutionary products, an iPod, a phone, and an internet communicator, and repeated them again and again until the audience realized he was talking about one single device. "Today, Apple is going to reinvent the phone," he declared. He then revealed the iPhone, a sleek device with a giant, for the time, 3.5-inch multi-touch screen, just one button on the face, and software that looked like magic. He demonstrated how you could flick through music, pinch zoom photos, and effortlessly scroll through contacts, all with your fingers. The crowd of tech aficionados went wild. People were literally cheering mid-demo as Steve showed off features like visual voicemail and the Safari web browser on a phone. It was one of his greatest presentations, filled with tension and humor, like when a prank caller rang the onstage iPhone and Steve joked, "Mom, I'll call you back later." But what the audience couldn't see was the incredible behind-the-scenes pressure. The iPhone units used in that demo ran on fragile pre-release software that could crash if Steve strayed from a very careful script of actions. The team had a golden path sequence he had to follow, rebooting devices out of sight as needed. Had an iPhone crashed or a call failed, it would have been obvious to all. No one but Steve could have pulled off that demo, gliding through features so smoothly that the flaws stayed hidden. His confidence and charisma made the iPhone look flawless that day. After the onstage demonstration, he paused and with a grin said, "It works." That brought the house down. One can imagine Steve backstage just before walking out for this pivotal keynote. Perhaps he closed his eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and felt the weight of history on his shoulders, knowing this was a product that truly could change the world if executed right. And then, mastering any nerves, he stepped out to do what he was born to do: enchant the world with technology. The iPhone launch is often viewed as a turning point in tech history. It indeed reinvented the phone. Within a few years, it obliterated established giants like BlackBerry and Nokia and it catalyzed the mobile revolution we all now live in. In 2008, Apple followed up by opening the App Store, allowing third-party developers to create apps for the iPhone. This move birthed the modern app economy. Everything from ride-sharing to social media apps have their roots in that decision. Steve's vision had extended beyond what even he could fully articulate on day one. He famously was hesitant about third-party apps at first, but once convinced, he embraced it wholeheartedly. The iPhone's success propelled Apple's financial fortunes to new heights. By 2010, Apple's revenues and stock price were climbing meteorically, and the company's market cap was soaring past even giants like Microsoft. The little Apple that was once on the brink was now arguably the most influential force in consumer technology. Throughout this period, Steve's working style remained intense. He was deeply involved in product decisions, from the color of the iPhone's icons to the feel of scrolling, and he spent long hours refining ideas with Jony Ive in Apple's design studio, which was almost a sacred space where prototypes were crafted. His relationship with key figures like Ive and Tim Cook had solidified. Tim Cook, whom Steve had hired back in 1998 to straighten out Apple's operations, had become the master of supply chain efficiency and a trusted right-hand man. Where Steve was the mercurial visionary, Tim was calm, methodical, ensuring Apple could build and deliver the millions of devices Steve's mind conjured. Steve often said hiring Tim was one of his best moves. Meanwhile, Steve's friendship rivalry with Bill Gates entered a new phase. By now, Steve was arguably outshining Gates in cultural impact, as Microsoft seemed stuck in the PC era while Apple led in post-PC devices. In 2007, at the D All Things Digital conference, Steve and Bill appeared together for a candid interview, reflecting on each other's contributions with mutual respect. Steve likened their relationship to the Beatles' song, Two of Us. You and I have memories longer than the road that stretches out ahead. The two men who had started as allies become fierce competitors and now elder statesmen of tech shared laughs on stage. It was a warm moment. Bill, in fact, after stepping down from Microsoft's day-to-day in 2008, would say that Steve Jobs was perhaps the only person who could really inspire consumers in the tech industry, praising his sense of design and focus. And after Steve's death, Bill would recount how in their last meetings, Steve showed him some designs for the future, and they chatted like old times. The competitive fire between them had cooled into genuine appreciation for each other's place in history. As 2009 arrived, Steve's health issues resurfaced. He had become noticeably thinner, and rumors swirled. In early 2009, Apple announced Steve was taking a medical leave to deal with health issues. It turned out his cancer had led to a liver transplant, which he received in Tennessee. Once again, Tim Cook stepped in to steer day-to-day operations during Steve's absence. Steve returned in late 2009, a bit frail but still very much at the helm, in time to unveil products like new iMacs and the remarkable iPad. Ah, the iPad, another visionary product that many were initially skeptical about. It had been a long dream of Steve's to create a tablet computer that was truly intuitive. The iPhone's success paved the way because people were now used to touchscreens and an app store full of software. In January 2010, Steve sat on stage in a comfy leather chair, swiping and pinching on this slim rectangular screen in his hand, showing off Apple's iPad. It was essentially like a big brother to the iPhone, oriented toward leisure and creativity. Web browsing, reading ebooks, playing games, watching movies, all on a gorgeous 9.7-inch display. Critics at first asked, "Isn't it just a big iPod Touch? Who needs this?" But when the iPad went on sale in April 2010, consumers provided the answer. In less than a month, 1 million iPads were sold. It turned out that a lot of people loved the idea of a light, fast, easy-to-use tablet for casual computing. Once again, Steve's sense of what people didn't even know they wanted proved stunningly accurate. The iPad started yet another wave, impacting the laptop market and making tablets mainstream. It also found eager adopters in education, business, and creative fields. By 2010, Apple Inc. was on an extraordinary high. It had been barely over a decade since Steve's return, and in that time, Apple had transformed from a niche computer maker on life support into one of the world's most valuable companies, and certainly its most admired. The company's products, iPod, iPhone, iPad, and the Mac, were category-defining. Apple stores were bustling temples of tech. Financially, Apple's market capitalization was nearing that of ExxonMobil for the title of world's most valuable corporation, a milestone actually achieved in August 2011. Steve's wealth had grown too, to roughly $8 billion by this point, though he still took only a one annual salary from Apple. His compensation largely came from stock holdings and, of course, his Disney shares. Colleagues noticed that Steve, while never losing his drive for perfection, had mellowed in personal interactions. He credited his family with keeping him sane and balanced. In the evenings, he would have dinner at home with Laureen and the kids, discussing everything from his day's meetings to his children's school projects. He remained a private family man despite his fame, driving them all in a Mercedes with no license plates, another of his quirks, to get sushi, or attending his son's freshman college orientation incognito in a baseball cap. However, by the start of 2011, it was clear Steve's health was taking a serious turn. The cancer and subsequent treatments had weakened him. He took another medical leave in January 2011. Even so, he made surprise appearances because he lived for Apple's product unveilings. In March 2011, he came on stage to launch the iPad 2, looking thin and a bit frail, but still his passionate self, extolling the device and even joking with the audience. "Isn't it amazing? I'm not dead yet." In June 2011, he made what would be his final public appearance at an Apple event, presenting the iCloud service at Apple's developer conference, a vision for seamlessly syncing content across devices, which was the next strategic leap for the company. Even as he fought illness, Steve kept thinking about Apple's future. One of his last major projects was the plan for Apple's new campus, a colossal spaceship-like circular building he envisioned in Cupertino. In June 2011, an obviously unwell Steve went to a Cupertino City Council meeting to personally pitch the campus design. He spoke softly but enthusiastically about how the building, set in a large park, would be a wonderful place for 12,000 Apple employees to create the products of the future. The council, and indeed the entire city, was charmed and receptive. It was one more instance of Steve's enduring love for Apple and innovation. Even in what he likely knew were his final months, he was planning a home that would inspire Apple employees for decades after he was gone. On August 24, 2011, Steve Jobs resigned as CEO of Apple, handing the reins to Tim Cook. In a brief letter, he said, "I have always said that if there ever came a day when I could no longer meet my duties and expectations as Apple's CEO, I would be the first to let you know. Unfortunately, that day has come." He requested to stay on as chairman of the board to continue contributing as he could. The news, though expected, felt like a gut punch to millions of Apple fans and admirers around the world. It truly signaled that Steve was very sick. And indeed he was. The cancer had spread, and he was spending most of his time at home in Palo Alto now, surrounded by family. In those final weeks, Steve reportedly spent a lot of time reflecting, being with Laureen and their children, and also meeting a few close friends and colleagues in farewell gestures. On October 5, 2011, Steve Jobs passed away at home at the age of 56. His wife Laureen, his children, and his sister Mona were by his side. According to Mona's moving eulogy, Steve's final words as he looked at his loved ones and then gazed past them were, "Oh wow." oh wow, oh wow. What he saw or felt in that moment, one can only wonder. Perhaps a glimpse of something beyond life, or simply awe at the beauty of having lived and loved. With those words, he slipped into unconsciousness and quietly died. The world reacted to Steve's death with an outpouring seldom seen for a business figure. Apple's website turned into a simple black and white page with Steve's name and lifespan beneath his portrait. At Apple stores across the globe, people left flowers, bitten apples, candles, and heartfelt notes, turning those glass windows into makeshift memorials. Many wept openly, as if a beloved artist or statesman had died. It was a measure of how much Steve's work had affected people's everyday lives. They listened to music, communicated, worked, and played on devices he brought into being. Tributes flowed from every corner. President Barack Obama hailed him as a visionary who exemplified the American spirit of innovation, saying most people learn of his passing on a device he invented. Bill Gates said it had been an insanely great honor to work with Steve and that he would miss him. Tim Cook, now Apple's CEO, encouraged Apple employees to honor Steve by dedicating ourselves to continuing the work he loved so much. Even in Disney parks, flags flew at half staff for a week, ordered by Bob Iger, because Steve, as a Disney board member and major shareholder, had been such an influential figure. On October 16, 2011, California declared Steve Jobs Day, and a private memorial was held at Stanford University, attended by luminaries from tech, entertainment, and politics, from former Vice President Al Gore to singer Joan Baez, an old friend of Steve's who had dated him briefly in the early 1980s, to Bono of U2. Coldplay performed, and stories were shared. Each attendee left with a small box containing a copy of the autobiography of a yogi, reflecting Steve's spiritual side. It was a book that he had first read as a teenager and reread during his cancer battle. In the weeks and months that followed, many continued to discuss and analyze Steve Jobs' life. Books were published, including the official biography by Walter Isaacson, which Steve, in his last months, had cooperated with because he wanted his kids to know his story from him, as he said. And what a story. Steve Jobs' life journey reads almost like a modern fable. The adopted boy who drops out of college follows his curiosity and intuition to start a company in a garage that changes the world, is lauded as a prodigy, then faces devastating failure and exile, only to return and achieve an even greater triumph, transforming multiple industries and attaining a kind of global fame reserved for rock stars. His personality was complex. He could be mercurial and harsh one moment, charming and inspirational the next. He was a perfectionist who drove those around him crazy at times, but also someone who could focus a team's energy like a laser, getting everyone to care as deeply as he did about making insanely great products. He had his flaws. He was not a saint or an easy person in many respects, but even those who felt his rough edge often still admired what he was trying to do. His passion was contagious. His belief that technology, when beautifully designed and infused with human touch, could enrich lives, was genuine and profound. Steve's legacy is visible everywhere today, in the smartphone in our pocket, the tablet on our coffee table, the animated films our children adore, the sleek computers that long ago escaped the drab confines of beige and bloomed with color and style. He reimagined how we interact with music, phones, and computers, making them more personal, intuitive, and fun. He was a master at sensing what people would want before they knew they wanted it. As he famously said in an interview, a lot of times people don't know what they want until you show it to them. He showed the world not one, but many new things. The personal computer, the mouse-driven interface, the animated blockbuster, the digital music player, the touchscreen phone, the tablet. Any one of these could have been a career capstone for someone, and he was instrumental in all of them. Toward the end of his Stanford address in 2005, Steve reflected on a motto he lived by: "Your time is limited, so don't waste it living someone else's life. He urged everyone to follow their heart and intuition, to do what they truly love, because that's the only way to do great work. Steve Jobs, in his 56 years on this earth, truly lived life on his own terms. He embraced the artistic and the scientific, the romantic and the practical, merging them in a way few have. He could stand at the intersection of technology and the humanities, exactly as he had aspired to do when he was a kid, inspired by Edwin Land of Polaroid. And from that crossroads, he built a company and products that have indeed changed the world. Now, as night falls and we conclude this tale, picture Steve in his signature black turtleneck, standing on a stage as the lights dim. He has one last look at the audience, at all of us whose lives he touched in some way, and he gives a small, appreciative smile. In a warm storyteller's tone, perhaps he'd say, "Stay hungry, stay foolish. Remember to follow your dreams, and never doubt that a group of passionate people can change the world, because, as he proved, they indeed can." With that, the stage fades to black, and our narrator's voice gently ends, leaving us with the inspiration and wonder of Steve Jobs' extraordinary life, echoing softly in our minds as we drift off into the night. Another field Edison plunged into around the turn of the century was energy storage, specifically the electric battery. With the rise of early automobiles in the late 1890s, many of which were electric cars at first, and the need for better power sources for electric railroad signals and other applications, Edison thought he could devise a new type of storage battery far superior to the heavy lead-acid batteries of the day. Beginning around 1899, he began work on an alkaline battery, one that would use alkaline electrolytes and electrodes of nickel and iron, which he believed would be lighter, more durable, and hold a greater charge. This project proved to be one of the most challenging of his career. Edison and his team tested literally thousands of combinations of materials. They tried different compositions for the electrodes: nickel hydrates, iron oxides, cadmium, and countless additives. They tried electrolytes from potassium hydroxide, alkaline, to various chemical cocktails. The West Orange lab turned into a battery factory of experimentation. Years passed, and the Edison cell was not yet performing as hoped. It would charge and discharge, but early versions were prone to problems like the active material flaking off the electrodes or the electrolyte carbonating and losing strength. Edison's employees grew frustrated. At one point, after a particularly disappointing test, a technician exclaimed, "All these months of work, we've got nothing to show. We've failed, Mr. Edison, failed 5,000 times." Edison, who by now had salt and pepper hair and the same fire in his gray-blue eyes, gave the fellow a reassuring grin. "Failed?" he echoed. "I have not failed. We've just found 5,000 ways that won't work." In Edison's view, every eliminated possibility was a step closer to the solution. He and his chemists pressed on. They tested 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 combinations, making incremental improvements. The battery quest stretched into 1903, with Edison sinking a small fortune into it. Many a night he stayed late measuring cells' performance. Finally, after nearly 10,000 experiments, Edison did it. He developed a battery with nickel oxide as the positive electrode, iron as the negative electrode, and potassium hydroxide as the electrolyte, the nickel-iron alkaline battery. It wasn't perfect, but it was robust and rechargeable. In tests, it proved far more durable than lead-acid batteries. It could be recharged many hundreds of times without significant degradation. By 1909, Edison was manufacturing and selling these Edison storage batteries. They found use in mining lamps, safe for miners because they didn't spill acid, in railroad signals, and even in some early electric delivery trucks and cars. Henry Ford, Edison's close friend, initially planned an electric car around 1914 using Edison's batteries, And though that particular venture didn't go far due to improvements in gasoline cars, Edison's batteries were used in other vehicles and remained in production for decades. They were heavy but extremely long-lasting. Some original Edison batteries still function over a century later in museums. In developing the battery, Edison once again demonstrated his hallmark traits: patience, perseverance, and an unshakable optimism. He quipped that he had never worked on anything so hard in his life as that battery. He was in his mid-50s by then, with the same relentless work ethic he'd had as a young telegrapher. And when at last the batteries began rolling out successfully, he took great pride in them. He had reason to. Versions of the Edison nickel-iron battery continued to be used for particular applications throughout the 20th century. Though Edison was famed as a solitary genius in the public imagination, by the early 1910s, he was part of a fraternity of great American inventors and industrialists. Chief among them was Henry Ford, the automobile pioneer. Ford had idolized Edison since meeting him at a conference in New York in 1896, when Ford was an unknown automobile engineer, and Edison, then in his late 40s, had enthusiastically encouraged Ford's idea of a gasoline automobile. At that 1896 dinner, when Ford explained his prototype internal combustion engine, Edison banged his fist on the table and said, "Young man, that's the thing! You have it! Your car is self-contained and carries its own power plant," giving Ford the encouragement that spurred him onward. The two men became personal friends in the ensuing years, bonding over their mutual love of invention and mechanics. In the mid-1910s, Edison, Ford, and tire magnate Harvey Firestone, along with naturalist writer John Burroughs, formed a famous camping group known as the Vagabonds. Almost every summer from 1916 to 1924, this quartet of famous friends would load up a caravan of Ford automobiles and venture into the American countryside for a 2-week camping trip. They sought to get away from civilization and reconnect with nature, albeit with a bit of luxury. They brought cooks and equipment along. There are wonderful photos of these journeys. Edison in a simple work shirt and suspenders, sitting by a campfire brewing coffee, Ford and Edison laughing together under the trees, Firestone serving up a pancake breakfast on a cast-iron griddle for his companions. One warm evening in 1921, deep in the woods of the Great Smoky Mountains, the Vagabonds sat around a crackling campfire. The sun had set and a million stars glittered overhead. Henry Ford poked the fire with a stick, sending a swirl of embers upward. In the orange glow, the faces of Edison and the others appeared almost ghostly. They traded stories as old friends do. Ford loved to prompt Edison to reminisce. "Tom," he said, "tell us about the time you set that railroad car on fire." Edison chuckled and launched into the tale of his boyhood baggage car laboratory and the accidental phosphorus fire, a story he had told many times, but his friends never tired of hearing it. Harvey Firestone laughed so hard at Edison's description of the furious conductor that he nearly spilled his tin cup of coffee. Even the usually stoic Burroughs grinned. Later that night, as the campfire burned low to embers, the conversation grew philosophical. The men fell into a companionable silence, gazing at the canopy of stars. Burroughs commented on how remarkable it was that in one lifetime they had gone from kerosene lamps to electric lights brightening the world. Ford added softly that Edison had been the one to make it happen. Edison, ever modest, shook his head. "I had a lot of help, and those principles were always there in nature, waiting to be discovered," he said. He looked up at the Milky Way stretching across the sky. "We don't know a millionth of 1% about anything," he mused quietly, a rare reflective moment for him. "There's always more to learn." The friends nodded in agreement. In the still summer night, these titans of invention sat together, content as crickets chirped in the bushes. In such moments, Edison was not the wizard or the tireless experimenter, but simply a man among friends, enjoying the simple wonder of the world that had always inspired him. You've been listening to Wispy History, where the past whispers and time stands still for a little while. If this story kept you company tonight, let me know what part lingered in your thoughts and tell me where in the world you're listening from. Don't forget to like and subscribe to help these quiet journeys continue. Until next time, rest easy, dream deeply, and remember, history is never really gone. It's only sleeping, waiting to be told again. Good night.